26. This is our passage for this morning. As we begin today, there is a challenge that I faced this week. This was kind of a little bit of a difficult passage because even though he is well known in some ways, Isaac is the son of the promise, yet he individually is not the most famous in the overall story. He doesn't carry a ton of significance in his own personal actions. He is significant primarily because he is the way in which God keeps the promise. The promise is kept through Isaac. Isaac's entrance in the story, his birth, is the really big promise that is fulfilled to Abraham. Isaac's birth is really the signal, the actual fulfillment that God kept his promise. And so that's the biggest, most important thing about Isaac, is that he was born as a fulfillment to the promise that God would make out of Abraham many nations, beginning with this son. And then the other important thing that Isaac does that is well known, that is usually the story that people are most familiar with about Isaac, is that he blesses his sons, Jacob and Esau. And there is a little trickery that happens. But Isaac is not the main character in the stories for which he is most well known. He's most well known for being the promised son. That is not something that he chose to do. He's most well known for blessing his sons Jacob and Esau, which he didn't even really do correctly, and he passed on the blessing. There's not a ton about Isaac that is just him making decisions about himself, except one chapter. Genesis 26 is the only chapter where Isaac finally becomes the main character of the story, and we get to see a little bit of what God is doing in and through Isaac. And this demonstrates, it seems to me, not always is everything in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, something that we should look at and say, go and do likewise. There are a lot of stories in the Old Testament about a lot of people doing a lot of interesting, weird, and pretty immoral things. And it doesn't mean that we should look at all those and replicate those actions in our lives. Now, we have seen Abraham, throughout the stories of his life that we've looked at, go from a man who knows nothing about God, a pagan man under what would eventually be known as Babylon, chosen out of thin air by the choice of God, building this relationship with God, and his faith is what he's very much known for his faith, but his faith did not immediately start out as strong. It began as a very weak faith, and then it became strong as the story of Abraham progressed. And the climax of the faithfulness of Abraham actually coincides with Isaac himself. The other very famous story about Isaac, of which he's also not the main character, is when Abraham, in the climax of his faith, offers, in obedience to God, his son Isaac as a sacrifice. God ends up stopping him, and he ends up sparing his life. We looked at this story before. And that was the climax of Abraham's faith. His faith journey was a steady progression, positively in the upward trajectory, so that by the end of his life, he was more faithful than at the beginning. Isaac is really kind of the opposite. Isaac is actually, in Genesis 22, the story that we looked at last week, where he's offered up as a sacrifice, Isaac, at the time, is a young man, probably in his mid-teens, maybe 20 at the oldest, and his father Abraham is over 100 years old. And he could have easily ran away or beaten this guy up at the moment he realizes that he's the one who's going on the altar, but he doesn't. Isaac allows, by faith, himself to be tied up and placed on the altar, and not knowing that he would be eventually spared, but trusting in his father and trusting in God. That is not only what I would think is likely the climax of Abraham's faith, it is really the climax of Isaac's faith. Abraham's life kind of ends with this big story of a grand act of faith, and Isaac's story begins with that very same act. There is this overlap, and yet the trajectory of Isaac is not to reach the heights of his father's faith and then take it and go twice as high or be twice as faithful. And oftentimes in our lives, we might wish that our kids only mimicked in their lives the most faithful, good aspects of our lives, but they sometimes mimic our faith, but more often they mimic our faults and our flaws as well. And this happens with Isaac. And so Isaac's journey is not one from weak faith to strong faith. It is actually one that is a strong faith that is actually weakening. It's not necessarily the kind of icon of faithfulness that perhaps someone like Joseph will eventually be. And yet, what seems to me to be the case is that in the story of Isaac, the underlying theme, whether Abraham is the main character, or Isaac is the main character, or later as we go through Genesis, Jacob and Joseph will be the main character. Joseph may be the main character of the whole entire book. He gets the most real estate. The point about all of these glimpses into the lives and the faith of these people is not to say that the relationship they have with God was merited, was earned, was achieved as a result of their perfect faithfulness, but rather to contrast the lack of faith of man and the consistent, unwavering, unbreakable faithfulness of God. If He made a promise to do something through this family, He is going to do it, whether it is through a person whose faith begins weak and becomes strong, or through a person whose faith starts strong and becomes weak, or when it comes to Jacob, someone whose faith is really sketchy and spotty all throughout with only glimpses of good faithfulness, maybe when he wrestles with God or sees the ladder or something of that nature. Or compared to Joseph, who's pretty much faithful all throughout his life. He may be the best example of faithfulness to God out of these four main characters in the book of Genesis. But no matter what level of faithfulness or what series of weakness or strength or improvement of faithfulness that you see in any of these main characters, the contrast in the book of Genesis is to a imperfect person compared to a faithful and perfect God. We asked before, last week, what is God going to do about sin? And what He says is that rather than recreating everything, I'm going to restore it. To all of the families I will bring restoration, but to all the families I will bring it through one family, through this particular group of people. And we have a description of what kind of family they are. And you may look in your family and say, there's a lot of brokenness here, there's a lot of sin, there's a lot of negative consequences. There is a lot of things that no one would label as godly faithfulness. And yet what you need to see in the book of Genesis is that it was never about your godly faithfulness that would earn you a relationship with Him. It could never be done. If you're Isaac, if you're Jacob, if you're Abraham, if you're Joseph, none of those people earned a relationship with God through the actions of their life. The actions of their life are a byproduct of that relationship, but never once for a moment, whether you're a very faithful or medium level, or you're the least faithful of all, like perhaps Isaac probably is compared to these four, it doesn't matter. The relationship that you have with God is started and is continued by God Himself. He says in His original promises to Abraham, I swear by myself that I will do these things. And so we see this most pronounced in the life of Isaac, who has a lot of problems, a lot of difficulties, and ends up not really making the best example of faith for us to follow. And it was a difficult passage because there are a lot of scattered things that are somewhat hard to tie together, but we have the best chance of tying together these big aspects of Isaac's life by looking at Genesis 26, verses 23 to 25. I'm going to read this Genesis 26:23-25. From there, he went up to Beersheba. And the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham your father. Fear not, for I am with you, and will bless you, and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. So he, Isaac, built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. Look at verse 23. From there, where is there? If it is true that once he arrived at the place he was going, that at that moment God appears to him, where was it that he's been? What has he been doing this whole time? Well, we see in chapter 25 the death of Abraham, Isaac's father. And after Isaac's father dies, Abraham, his life 175 years, after he dies, it says in chapter 25, verse 11, 25:11, after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son. And Isaac settled at Beer Lahai-roi. Beer Lahai-roi. Now, this doesn't mean anything to you, but what you should know is that Beer Lahai-roi is the place where there's a well there, but that is really where Ishmael, where he and his descendants lived and settled. We see the very next section is in chapter 25. These are the generations of Ishmael. Ishmael, we see in verse 18, that after they've listed all the things that he's done, they settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. He settled over against all his kinsmen. Isaac, it says in chapter 25, Isaac and Ishmael, Abraham's son, buried him, and then Isaac went to settle near Ishmael. It seems that he left the original place, the place where God had made his promises to Abraham. Abraham had kind of set up and set up camp and become faithful, where he spent the last years of his life, a place called Beersheba, a place that is that they have a well. If you live in the desert, a well is like having a nation that's completely energy independent. It is your access to life. If you don't have a well, you cannot survive if you live in the desert. It is not possible. And so they have this well. And Isaac previously had lived in the place of the promise. Beersheba is when the land of Israel is marked out. Here is the top and bottom. Beersheba is listed as the place that will demark the southernmost border of the promised land. That's like the very bottom of it is marked by this place. So in Beersheba is the promised land. South of Beersheba is other land. It is not part of the land of promise. That's why Ishmael lives over there. And Isaac grew up and lived in Beersheba. After Abraham's death, Isaac, rather than staying and living in the land of his father, and he moves out of this land. Now in that, it says in the beginning of chapter 26, it was while he was in this land where Ishmael lived that a famine comes about. Now this is ironic because you and I have probably done things in our lives that we look at, and this happens to me often. I say, that's like a thing I do because my father did this. Like, I do this because my dad does this. And I'll see it, and sometimes someone else will see it in me. They'll go, oh man, that's your dad. I've started wearing a lot of cargo pants recently, and my mom was like, you're so much like your father. It's insane. There's just so many pockets. Like, you have everything that you need with you at all times. Like, I don't know, I should have been wearing these all the time. Just like your father. Well, this happens to Abraham. Abraham is encountered with and Abraham leaves the homeland and he goes down to Egypt, and he has this problem where he thinks that once he gets to Egypt, they'll think my wife, and they will kill me. And then they will take Sarah into the harem of the king. What he does is he says, tell everybody you're my sister. It ends up going well. This is an act of unfaithfulness. Abraham didn't really think God could preserve his life and continue it on to the next generation, and so he tried to do it by himself. Well, like they say, like father, like son. Now there was a famine in the land besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And in the days of Abraham, Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, which is ironic. The same thing happens. Abraham tried to pull the Sarah's actually my sister card in Egypt. Then later on, he pulls the same card to the same people. Not only are you like your father in that you do the same things, you do them to people. He goes to Gerar, to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, and the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt and dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land. The word sojourn means dwelling in tents as a foreigner. You are traveling from one place to another, knowing that you are not settling there. There is sojourning and settling, and those are different things. Settling is like I'm putting down roots and I'm going to stay here. When I got married, I've moved. My wife has never really moved in her whole life. And I lived like a very, before I got married, I lived like a very minimalist life. I had like 4 or 5 shirts. I would like wear them and switch them, and then I would wash them once they're all dirty. I was a very minimal person, and I lived out of a travel bag. All my toiletries in a travel bag. And when we got married, I just kept on living out of my travel bag. I was like, dude, if I ever need to go anywhere, all my stuff is like right here. It's like so convenient. And Kara didn't like that. She was like, why can't you take it out? And I was like, why do I have to take it out? What's the big deal? And what I didn't realize is, to her, it seemed like I was staying prepared to get up and leave. It was like I wasn't going to stay very long. I was preparing and getting my stuff ready just in case I needed to leave and go somewhere else. And I thought that was, I never thought anything about that. But that was kind of the idea. Is like you're here, but you're prepared to leave and to move on to the next place. You're not settling and putting down roots there. And while Isaac is on his way, not to Egypt like his father, but to the Philistines, the land of the Philistines, God makes a promise. But the promise is a future tense. Chapter 26, verse 3, sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and will bless you. And for to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father, and I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands, and in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Shall is future, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. I will do these things for you. That's a future promise. It's going to happen. Your father was obedient and faithful to me, and so I will continue the promises on from him to the next generation. And I will do this. This is a possibility that I will continue this through you. But he is now living outside of the land of promise. You see, what's interesting is that God often moves us from where we are, transitions us through trials. How do we know to get up and go from the place that we are? Oftentimes it is when something very difficult or negative takes place in our lives. Trials are often a way in which God speaks to us to tell us to get up and move and go from sometimes not just a geographical location, like from one place to the next. It may be that. Sometimes it is that. For me, it's been that many times in my life. But this also, on a spiritual level, means it is not God's desire that you would never encounter trials in your life at all. On a spiritual plane, on a spiritual level, it is often the trials that come often as a natural consequence of your sins and negative actions in your life, consequences of those things, and the trials that come from them are a big red warning sign that says you must turn and go away from these practices. You can't keep on doing this in life because what you're experiencing now will not magically change. You can have a famine and you can keep growing food all that you want, plant and seed, but you are never going to reap a harvest. You can't expect to do things your way and reap God's rewards. And so sometimes, like he does here with a famine, he moves Isaac out of his place towards the land of promise, closer to the land of promise, through this trial. And when he gets there, he goes to the Philistines because they have food. And he goes there, and ironically, he goes from a place where he couldn't grow food to this new place, and he sets up camp temporarily to be around them. And what happens to him, he does exactly what his father does when he gets into the land and says, hey, Rebecca, my smoking hot wife, please tell everybody that you are my sister. Now, this is not only to say that Isaac had a lack of faith in some instances, but also to say that your mistakes will often be replicated in your children. But what's unfortunate also about Isaac is not only does he make this mistake, try to preserve his offspring, his life, because he doesn't have kids yet, trying to preserve that all the way on his own, but he also gets publicly rebuked by a believer. You know your sin is bad when people who don't really care about sin or righteousness are so appalled with your act, they will call you out themselves. This is like the idea of losing before unbelievers your reputation as a follower of Christ. You lose your ability to say, hey, Christ has acted and worked in my life, because they've seen your life and they go, if that's the kind of people that Jesus produces, I don't want anything to do with that guy. What happens is he has told Rebecca to tell everybody she's his sister, and they come and they're like, hey, you're with the king's harem now. And what happens is that Abimelech receives this vision. He's spoken to by God, and he says to Isaac, dude, what are you doing? Verse 9, so Abimelech called Isaac and said, behold, she is your wife. How then could you say she is my sister? And Isaac said to him, because I thought lest I die because of her. Abimelech said, what is this that you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. And so Abimelech warned all the people, saying, whoever touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. That's a man who seems to care more about the truth than the supposed man of God. As I mentioned, Isaac is not a bastion of faithfulness. He is not the perfect example of the perfectly faithful servant. But that doesn't mean God can't use him. And so he gives him back his wife, and then what happens? Then he goes from a place that has been in famine to this new place, and he sojourns there, and he sets up his camp temporarily, and he plants a seed, and in 1 year he reaps a harvest. For every seed that he planted, 100 crops grew for every one single seed. He became 12. Isaac sowed in the land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. And what's unfortunate about this is exactly what causes the Israelites to be enslaved in Egypt. The Israelites grow, and they have kids, and their numbers are growing, and God is blessing them. They have wealth, and they have money, and they have herds and crops and harvests. And the Egyptians look around and say, they have grown to the extent that if they decide to turn on us, we could not defeat them. And so this is actually the same rationale that the Philistines are having now, is the same rationale that the Egyptians had as a cause to enslave all of the Hebrews for 400 years. They look around and they see God's blessings and they hate them. And now what's interesting too, and I think this says a lot on a spiritual level about how the enemy wants to react to the people of God. Verse 15, the Philistines had stopped and filled with earth all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham, his father. This guy's rich. This guy has wells. Wells are self-sustaining sources of life. And apparently he had multiple, and many of them he had inherited from his father Abraham. Remember, Abraham had lived in this place earlier in Abraham's life, and he had to take, they say, rather than capture the wells, use the wells for ourselves, we're going to fill them in, because if we can't have it, no one can. It's not that the people who don't love the Lord see the blessings of the Christian life, that the enemy, that Satan, those who do his will, that they look around and they see the blessings and they go, blessings. If that was true, perhaps the Philistines should have said, bring us in on the love. Let us know what God is doing this for you and how we can serve him. But they don't do that. Rather than trying to get wells for themselves or to simply take his wells, they would rather nobody has the wells. So they fill them up with water. And often this can be the difficulty when in your life you're trying to overcome sin, allowed yourself to be surrounded with either people, practices, habits in your life, that for every chance you want to dig a new well towards the waters of life, there is someone or something standing next to you, and for every shovel of dirt you dig out, they shovel it right back in. And so what happens to Isaac is he has to separate himself from these people, and he goes down the road and digs a well. And they follow him and contest that well. Later on in verse 20, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, this water is ours. So he called the well Esek, which means they contended with him. Then he goes down the road, verse 21, they dug a well, and they quarreled over that also. So he called its name Sitnah, which sounds very similar in the Hebrew word to Satan. Enmity. That means enmity. Consistent, ongoing battle between good and evil. That's the same word used in Genesis 3, the curse that the serpent and the woman's offspring. Enmity, an ongoing battle between the two that will take place. He moves on down the road again. He moved there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel, so he called its name Rehoboth. Rehoboth means room. Now, God had been blessing him in the land of the Philistines, and it had grown so much that it became impossible for the Philistines to live so close to the man of God's blessing. And so he has to move, and they follow him there, and they follow him to the next place. And then finally, he gets to a place where there is room for God to bless him. And to be honest, in our lives, the trials that we face, which will often unseat us from where we are, both maybe geographically, maybe habitually in our lives, those things that will uproot you from where you have been are not meant to cause you greater distress. Meant so that the Lord can bless you even more once you will follow him to the place he wants you to go. My life is this. I didn't ever think, no offense to I didn't even know Woodlawn. I wasn't thinking about it. And if right when I had left my church in Arkansas, somebody had said, I think I'm going to name that church Sitna Free Will Baptist. Right when I had left that church, if somebody had said, hey, there's a little old country church in Woodlawn that, needs a pastor, I would have been like, nope, country churches, not doing them anymore. Not going to work. They're all mean and rude and make my life miserable. And that difficulty, the season of my life in Arkansas was very difficult, and it actually led to a season that was maybe the most difficult in my life, which was where I was out of ministry for a couple of years doing construction, which taught me a lot but was not the most fun I've ever had. And it was a time where I really was like, it was a sojourn in my life. I don't know where I'm putting down roots, and I don't know how to set up camp. And I'll tell you, this is how I know I wasn't ready to. I, last week, got a Tennessee driver's license. The reason that I didn't get a Tennessee driver's license when I left Arkansas and came back to Nashville is because I didn't think I was going to be here for very long. I didn't know where I was going to go. Why get a Tennessee license, and then 2 weeks later, now I moved to Oklahoma or to North Carolina or to Alabama or wherever I was going to move. And so literally I just kept my Arkansas driver's license because I was like, hey, I'm not staying here for very long. And then 2 years later, I'm still there, and I don't know what's happening. And then all of a sudden, I get this meeting at Cracker Barrel with the deacons, and lo and behold, now the Lord has taken me to a place that I might think of very similar to how Isaac felt about this new well. I've got a place where I feel like I have room, where God has blessed my family more than I could have imagined. And for me, that was a geographical change. I moved from one location to another. But for you, this could be a habitual lifestyle change where you have so much crowd in your life that it wants to bless, whether it be through the discipleship you have, the relationship you have, the amount of prayers the amount of time you spend praying. You have the time in your day, but it's so crowded that perhaps the Lord is asking you to cut something out, relocate it, or scrap it all together so that you now have room to grow in your relationship with Christ. And that brings us to verse 23. From there he went up. I'm going to go quickly. From there he went up to Beersheba. Beersheba is the original home place. It's the land. To the best of my knowledge, Jacob and Esau are born here. They dig a well here. You can go visit this place. It now is a modern city that's kind of down the road a little bit, but they have archaeological digs that have discovered the walk through the streets. There are walls, there are houses, see the altar. You can actually go to this place. Beersheba is the southernmost tip of what God has described as the promised land. Once, and the land of the Philistines, he has now reached the land of his father, the land of promise. He is now in the promised land where he was not before. He was the son of promise as a fulfillment to Abraham, those promises to God. And now God has said, if you will follow me where I will lead you, I will now establish your father's promises and carry them on to you. But he didn't get them. He didn't get them when he was with Ishmael. And he didn't get them. He had riches and wealth, but that's not really the promise. He didn't get them while he was in the land of Philistines. It's only at the time where he arrives in the promised land that he receives the promise of God. That's what the word Beersheba is saying. Verse 24, the Lord appeared to him the same night. That means as soon as he crossed over the border, and now he wasn't in the promised land, and now he is. As soon as he got there, then the Lord appeared to him. And he said, it's not, I will be your God, I will fulfill the promises, I will make you multiply, and I will bless your offspring. What does he say now? He takes the promise of Abraham, and now he applies it to Isaac. I am the God of Abraham, your father. I am the God of Abraham, your father. And so he establishes with Isaac the promises that he made to Abraham. And he says to him, fear not, for I am with you. And the phrase, I am with you, is an example of what in the Bible we have called progressive revelation. It means that the former people knew less about how God was going to deal than the people who came after them. As you flip the pages, you're adding, stacking, improving, increasing the amount of information you know. Now we know more than Isaac ever knew about how God is going to deal with the sin in human hearts. Now we know more. But Isaac receives the first example of this, which is an expansion of the covenant. When he says, I am the God of your father Abraham, he is establishing it with Isaac. He says, I am with you. I'm going to live among you. I'm going to be a part of you and your people. This is an expansion of even what he made to Abraham. I am with you, and I will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. Multiply your offspring. Abraham had a problem with her even having a child, and now Isaac will turn, and when him in the very next couple of chapters, when the sons are born, in the chapter before, in chapter 25, Isaac, in 25 verse 20, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean, the sister of Laban, and Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. That's father like son. The same story. She was barren, and they prayed. And Abraham prayed for a long time, and it didn't happen. And then it happened in Isaac. And now Isaac has the chance to carry it on, and his offspring will be the ones who receive the promise. And now, rather than not having any kids, Isaac prays, and Rebekah has 2. And now, who will God choose to be the son of the promise? And that's a story that we will see in weeks to come. But the last thing that I want you to see in this chapter that I think really, or this passage that summarizes much of Isaac's life and his importance to the story. Verse 25. He's been on a sojourn. I'm in a place, but not for long, and I move on to the next place over and over again, but I'm not in the final home. I'm not in the land of the promise. And then God says, I am with you. And in response to this, Isaac doesn't sojourn, he settles. There are 3 things here that are like permanence. He's taking the toiletries out of the bag, and he's actually staying. He built an altar. You build an altar because you're worshiping, planning on worshiping again in the future. In 1957, when this church was started, they could have just met out in the open air. They met under a tree. They could have just put up a tent, but they didn't. They fixed up the schoolhouse. Why? Who cares? Why do that? Because they were planning on using it next week. And the week after, we are establishing a place where we can worship, and Isaac does this. He's not sojourning anymore. He's settling in the place where God has fulfilled his promise. So he built an altar. That's number 1. Then he called upon the name of the Lord, and he pitched his tent there. This is the idea, like we are stopping here. And eventually they will swap out the tents for stone structures, which you can actually see in the archaeological digging that they've done. And then thirdly, the last sentence, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. This means that not only are we going to be here, but we can have life here. And so Isaac does not have any stories where he is like the character, where he is giving the example of faith that's like, hey, go and do likewise. How about you guys lie to your boss so that he won't have an affair with your wife? That's a stupid thing to do. That's ridiculous. Don't do that. Isaac doesn't have his decisions that's like, hey, this is that you do, and this is exactly what you need to follow in your life. But Isaac does have a legacy. He is significant. And the reason you know this is from the New Testament. And I want to read to you just out of all the things Isaac did, out of the fact that he was a patriarch, out of the fact that he was a kind of the founding father of part of this movement, there is a passage in Hebrews chapter 11 called the Hall of Faith. And Isaac's name is in there. It doesn't get as many sentences as Moses. It doesn't get as many sentences as Abraham or Joseph or a number of other people. And even the commendation that he gets is kind of him still not being the main character. But the last thing I'll leave us with is to see what we see in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 20. The author of Hebrews has just talked about how faithful Abraham was, but then he gets to Isaac. And you can see the difference between the two. In verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, he offered up who had received as the promise, and of offering offered up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And then he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. And then in verse 20, it's Isaac's turn. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. It's like this grand resume about how faithful Abraham was, and then it's like Isaac also blessed his kids, which is a thing that it's like the thing you do before you die. It's the last thing. It's the last thing Jacob does with Joseph at the end of the book of Genesis. It's the last thing that Isaac does with Jacob and Esau before he goes blind and he's basically incapacitated. It's the thing that Jacob is trying to get his father to give him instead of Esau. That is the blessing. And what I think is so significant about this is that all the things that you do in your life, the only lasting legacy is a legacy of faith. That's it. That's all that you get. In fact, even though Abraham has a greater faith and receives a commendation for more acts of faith, which he himself has done, the legacy of Abraham is still in this chapter faith that he had in God. It is only the legacy of faith that will last. You can pass down whatever type of inheritance that you want to your kids. And maybe it makes it to your kids and you do that successfully, which is even hard to do. I've been around enough funerals to have seen a lot of families ruined by probate court. And maybe it makes it to them. But what about to their grandkids and the ones after them? By the time it gets to your grandkids or great-grandkids, anything that you left to your children is likely gone. More than likely. The lasting legacy that you can give to your children, that you can establish in your family, is an inheritance of faith. And it is the stronger legacy because it is the only legacy that has no timeline. You don't measure that kind of a legacy like you do an inheritance that's measured by a decade or 2 decades or a century. The legacy of faith is measured by eternity. And it is to those eternal things that our lives must be centered. And if it will be true like father, like son, like mother, like daughter, then may those repetitive, habitual behaviors that our kids pick up from us naturally, more is caught than taught, may those behaviors be behaviors of faithfulness to God. Because they're watching. And they see you. And they hear you and they understand, as I have learned with my little children, they know so much more than I ever thought that they would. They hear and remember so much more than I ever anticipated. And I have to make sure that I watch myself because they will pick and choose. They will catch certain things. But may it be true of our lives that no matter what happens, the greatest thing that they pick up from us is our faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. Heavenly Father, we come before you today. So thankful for this story of Isaac, who, like many of us probably in our lives, was not always faithful to you. And yet in this story, the central theme is that you are faithful to your promises and you work through even the most frustrating of people. And God, there are many frustrating people in our lives, in churches today. And yet often, God, it is us, like we as individuals are the frustrating people who have a lack of faith. And may we be encouraged by this story not to live our lives exactly like Isaac, but to know that our lives probably look a lot more like Isaac's than we would like to admit. But even still, it was never our actions in our lives that could have earned us your grace. It was your faithfulness to promises that you made to give grace to all those who would believe. It is to those promises that we look. And hopefully, if we look long enough and hard enough, that our children will know that they should look as well. And that in so doing, you will, like you did physically with Abraham, create a nation of descendants who were the people of God, that through each family here, that our faithfulness and the example of godly faithfulness that comes from our lives would create in our lineage a spiritual offspring that will be your people through faith. And so, God, we just look to this story as an example, not of Isaac's faithfulness, not a mirror of our faithfulness, but of your faithfulness. And you're faithful to your promises. And you always have been, and you always will be. And so, Lord, we lift these things up to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Follow him there, or a sin no more hath dominion.